My name is Roshni, and I'll be the moderator for today's Critical Conversation. The Critical Conversation series has been conceived as an TREB USA initiative aimed at engaging the entire Jamaat, but with a focus on 18 to 40-year-olds. The series aims to explore the critical questions of our time within the context of our faith. Before we begin today, I'd like to read a land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. To recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and a way of honoring the Indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. It is important to understand the long existing history that has brought us to reside on the land and to seek to understand our place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historical context, as colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. We would like to open our session today by acknowledging that land on which I reside is the occupied unceded Seas territory of Tonkawa, Lipan Apache, Karunkawa, Comanche, and Coahuitecan people in the Austin, Texas area. These tribes have stewarded this land throughout the generations, and we'd like to pay our respects to elders both past and present. We believe the work we do in sessions like these are part of our ongoing responsibility to acknowledge the ongoing harm that is done to Indigenous peoples on this land, and working towards a society that is more just, equitable, and in keeping with our ethics as Ismaili Muslims. So during our 50th session today, we'll be exploring the colonization of Indigenous communities, where we will explore the systems that continue to perpetuate marginalization of Indigenous peoples, and also reflect on our duty as Muslims to work towards reducing such marginalization and acknowledging the inherent rights of Indigenous communities. During this session, you'll also see a Q&A box, which you can share additional questions or thoughts during the presentations. We'll also try to address as many questions submitted during today's talk as we can. And with that, I'm honored to introduce to you our wonderful speakers for today's session. We have Dr. Shaista Abdul Aziz Patel, who identifies as a Pakistani Muslim feminist scholar and works as the Assistant Professor of Critical Muslim Studies at UCSD. In her scholarly and other political work, she asks questions situated at the intersections of race, caste, gender, sexuality, class, and multiple colonialisms. We also have Zainab Amadahy, who's an author, researcher, and educator. Among her publications is Wielding the Force, the Science of Social Justice, which explores how emerging science has relevance for spiritual development, social justice, and community organizing. Zainab is a frequent contributor to Muskrat magazine, and she's also worked for a variety of community organizations in the areas of Aboriginal services, Indigenous knowledge reclamation, women's services, immigrant settlement, and community arts. Zainab's also written extensively on questions of solidarity and decolonization of Turtle Island. In 2008, she co-authored an important and widely read book chapter, Indigenous Peoples and Black People in Canada, Settler or Allies, with Mi'kmaq scholar Bonita Lawrence. At the outset, we'd also like to note that the views of our speakers expressed during the course of this discussion are their own. Okay, let's now turn to our conversation. So before we begin, we'd really love if the speakers can share a little bit more about yourselves and kind of what brings you here. Zainab, would you like to get us started?
Thank you for that. And I appreciate the land acknowledgement as well. I am currently on Anishinaabe territory in a place called Nogajiwaning. And I live on the borders of the Odainabe River. So that's in Canada for folks who don't know, somewhat outside of the city of Toronto. So yeah, about me, I know that one of the things that I was asked to kind of speak about in terms of who I am is my name, which always gets me into a lot of really interesting conversations. Zainab Amadahy is not my legal name. It's the name that I started to write under some like 35, 40 years ago. My legal name is Virginia Green, if you can believe it. Some people hate it when I say that, but I was named after my grandmother, who was named after the state of Virginia, where she lived. And the state of Virginia, of course, was named after the Virgin Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth. I can't remember which number, but it's not a name that I identified with very much. My heritage is African American, Cherokee or Chalaki, and Seminole, and various other things, but it ain't British. So I didn't relate to that very much. And Green was a name that my father's family took after emancipation. So when I wrote my first book, I wanted to publish it under a pseudonym, and I had done some research, and I knew someone named Zainab from Kenya who told me the story of that name, and I thought that would reflect my, who I really was, my ethnicity, and all of that. And Amadahy is a Cherokee word at the time. I've never had actually a relationship with a Cherokee community, although I have ancestry from the Seminoles and the Cherokee. I have never lived in community. My family's from a place called Staunton, Virginia. Both my African American and Cherokee ancestors were enslaved on the Reynolds tobacco plantation, and that's as far back as I know my family history to be. But I did want to honor those ancestors, and so I took the name of Amadahy, which I believe means she walks the forest. So that's kind of my story, my background. I got interested in these ideas because my parents were activists. During the civil rights movement, I grew up during that movement. I grew up during the American Indian movement. And my mom, when she was alive, used to like to say that I was an activist before I was born, because of course she was out on picket lines and marches and demos when she was pregnant with me. So I kind of had no choice. So that's who I am. Thank you for asking.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Zainab. Dr. Shaista, would you like to share a little bit?
Thank you. Just call me Shaista. It doesn't, titles do not make sense to me when my teacher and mentor Zainab Amadahy is here, and so I do not want to be called doctor at all, especially in this gathering. But thank you. So Yali Maded, everyone. I hope everyone's doing well. I I am also from Toronto, but now I live for my job. I live in San Diego, which is the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay peoples, and given my location, and also because I'm slowly coming into an understanding of what land acknowledgements mean, I also think it's important to acknowledge the waters. And, I live 5-minute drive from Pacific Ocean. And so, Oceania has connected so many indigenous communities and islands. So, I do not know much, but this is something that is new to me. So I'm just coming into an understanding of how to think about land acknowledgements that do not hold on to the binary of land and oceans, land and water. So so with that, I also just want to to say, and this is something I was telling my brother as well, I might be naive, but I don't think 10 years ago or 5 years ago this conversation could have happened with or being hosted by ITREP. So I just want to say that I am just so happy, because I never thought that my scholarly work would have any place in my community. Honestly, I wasn't sure. So I'm just really happy that this is happening. And I also just want to say that it is such an honor for me to share this space with Zainab, from whom I met Zainab in my first year of grad school. I'm not going to say how many years ago this was, but let's say this was at a time when, to send messages, there was no text and you tied notes to pigeon legs. I'm kidding. But, it was many, many, many years ago. And I have learned so much from Zainab and, from other communities of racialized, indigenous, and Black feminist scholars and Black feminist organizers and scholars who've taught me so much. So just wanted to begin with that. And it's also such an honor to have Zainab here talking to my community. So I'm just really, really happy. As for me coming into this work, I post 9/11, right? Like we grew up with this sense of racial injury, and this sheer anger that I had at men, with images being flashed on screen that looked like the men in my family, looked like my father, brother, uncles, cousins, and all of that. So I was really, really trapped in this sense of racial injury and Islamophobia. And so when I came into my graduate program, I really wanted to examine. Well, I did my master's at UBC, University of British Columbia, and then PhD at University of Toronto. But when I came into my master's program at UBC, I wanted to study how Muslims are racialized and what that violence means. And at that point, I started to examine the Anti-Terrorism Act of Canada. And my project was, between education and legal studies. And I looked at how at the site of law, Muslims were racialized. And it was through my research, then also through amazing Indigenous mentors like Professor Graham Smith, who was there at UBC at that time, that I began to realize that the very first people who have been marked as terrorists are the Indigenous peoples of this land. And once that realization hit me, as they say, like your life changes. So everything, the questions that I had, they were there, but I needed to reframe everything. And so, so while I did look at the Anti-Terrorism Act of Canada, for me, what became really important was educating myself about colonial histories of this land, but also Indigenous resistance. And so, years ago, this is how I got into this work, so to say. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for sharing that. I think it really helps the audience understand, where you're coming from and the perspectives you'll be bringing today. So, and today, we'll be kind of focusing the conversation on the first peoples of this continent. We'd love for both of you to talk a little bit about the terms indigeneity and settler colonialism and kind of what those mean.
Yeah, so where I'm living right now, and at this moment in time, because terminology changes over time, but Indigenous is kind of the politically correct word in many contexts to use. I know that there are Indigenous scholars who have various definitions out there in the world of what that means. I know that there are global definitions as well. When I use that term, well, when we're talking here, and when we're talking about the context of Turtle Island or North America, we're talking about the first people, the first nations of this territory. In Canada, there's some legal status issues where we're talking about First Nations, Inuit and Métis peoples. But for me, I also include non-status folks in that. And yeah, over time, I know that when I was younger, Native American was the term that you would use in the States. And now I think people are looking for and using different terminology in Indigenous communities. People like to refer to themselves in their own languages, Anishinaabe, Ongwahongwe, whoever you are. You have a word that describes who you are as and what your relationship is to a very specific piece of land. So those are kind of my comments off the top. Yeah.
Thank you, Zainab. Shaista, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, thank you. I think, Zainab, you make a really important point, and this is something that I struggled with as a settler scholar who draws on Indigenous studies, how to to get very specific about naming, because I think it's so important. And I do feel that things are different in the US and Canada in terms of just how education has been, just in terms of education and how quote unquote visible or how this visibility, the legibility of ongoing colonial violence is recognized. And as somebody who's now in California, I mean, it looks really different than it did back home in Toronto. So, so, as Zainab rightly put it, the definitions of Indigenous has changed. I mean, if you look at from 1982, when the UN, through the activism of Indigenous peoples, right? It's not that the UN woke up and said, oh, let's do something, but through the activism of Indigenous peoples in the 1970s and 1980s, the definition that was released for Indigenous it looks really different. I mean, it was an essentialized definition at that time. And so there's so much to say, but, one of the examples, and sorry, I have it noted down because then I forget things. For me, one of the things that I do want to get across today, I mean, Indigenous has a lot of definitions. It's, there are whole books written on this, so it's not possible to say it in one response, but, Indigenous can be thought of as a political category that enables solidarity among different Indigenous peoples and nations, right? And one of the examples that I very, very quickly want to mention is Indigenous people of Sikkim, the Himalaya regions in India, who are called the Lepchas. They have, Indigenous youth from Sikkim. The Lepchas have are in solidarity, like they are in conversation with Diné youth of Navajo Nation, which is one of the, I think, the largest federally recognized, what here people call tribe, what I would like to call nation, right? So Diné youth and Lepchas have gotten in conversation and are, working towards amazing, brilliant decolonial conversations, because Lepchas are protesting. I think the building of, my numbers might be off, but it's in the vicinity. They are protesting the building of 27 dams on their sacred sites by the Indian government, right? And one of the things that I quickly want to mention is that India, for those of us who look at multiple colonialisms, for us, India is also a colonial occupation. It's also a settler colonial occupation, right? Whether it's about Kashmir, Sikkim, Assam, or other places. And so they were protesting the building of dams in 2007. And then the Diné youth were protesting in Arizona coal mining and use of what do you call it, fossil fuel, right? And they got into conversation and started to, and that just blew my mind, right? Like how that solidarity works. So what is, I mean, just to even think, right? Like well, at least in my limited understanding, this is, to go from the Himalayas to the deserts of Arizona, like who would have thought of this connection? So, that for me was important. And I think, sometimes people say that, linking environment, spiritual, and other traditions of Indigenous people globally, rather than thinking about parallel and related colonialisms, is important. But I think that just essentializes indigeneity. So, different Indigenous groups cannot be racialized into one monolithic Indigenous, which Zainab put it so much more coherently. But for me, this is what Indigenous means. And in terms of white settler colonial violence, I do want to say, and this is also a very complicated conversation, but just for, for sort of raw and limited conversations, what is important to understand is, there's colonialism in India. So, the East India Company came in 17th, 18th century, 18th century, and then 19th century official colonialism happened in India with the British. But then 1947, Pakistan and India were created, the British left, right? So that was colonialism as an event. White settler colonialism, which is, in the US, Canada, many would argue Mexico, Israel, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand, these are white settler colonialisms where the settlers never left, right? And so, while colonialism is an event, white people came and left, white settler colonialism is where the settlers never left. So this for me, and the violence is ongoing, right? So US is still colonially occupied, Canada is still colonially occupied. So yeah. And and the violence is really brutal, and it's just that people think often of Israel and Palestine. When colonialism is 60 plus years old versus almost 500 years old, something becomes a norm. So it's become a norm here, but the violence is no less brutal than what is happening in Palestine.
Thank you both so much. Really helpful to see so many of these kind of connections that you're all making, which I think helps all of us from wherever we're calling in from. Next, I'd really love for us to kind of talk a little bit about the roots of colonial violence committed against Indigenous communities. Can you provide some examples and help us understand also how this violence can be perpetuated?
Sure. Thanks for that question. It feels like a huge question, and it feels like one of those questions that are kind of necessary, but it's also like, I have to give Indigenous Studies 101, in two countries, in a matter of a few minutes. So the short answer to the question is that, the colonial violence that we see in our society today is based, of course, in white supremacy and settler colonialism. That, of course, is the short answer. When I listen to folks, Indigenous folks here, talk about the roots of of colonization and all of the violence that they've survived over these centuries, they usually start with the doctrine of discovery, which I think is something that many peoples around the world can relate to. So, the narrative is that land theft in Canada and the US is grounded in that centuries-old doctrine of discovery, which is issued in a papal bull, I believe, in 1493. And it permitted Christian explorers and settlers to seize the lands of non-Christians. And obviously that was about wealth, accessing wealth and resources around the world, in the name initially of the church, but also in the name later on of nation states and other denominations of Christians. So the doctrine regarded Indigenous peoples all over the world as subhumans, authorized all kinds of atrocities, including forced conversions, enslavement, and all of it aimed at clearing the land of these, bothersome people who were in the way. And, once they could clear that land, then of course, white colonizers, settlers, refugees, whoever it was, could claim it or could extract resources from it, or. And the doctrine of discovery is still the basis for Canada's claims to sovereignty over lands that were occupied by Indigenous nations for thousands of years. In Canada, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 affirmed the principles of the doctrine of discovery and put forward the idea that no one owned these lands prior to European arrival. There's a fallacy that the lands in some cases were completely empty. And that notion still impacts Indigenous land claims or First Nations land claims to this day. I'm going to put a link in the chat that is an analysis of the doctrine of discovery that you can find on the Assembly of First Nations website. And it's going to talk about their efforts to dismantle the impact of that doctrine of discovery here in Canada. So if you'll just give me a minute. I am old, I'm 66 years old. So all this computer stuff is just very challenging for me. So I hope that went through. So to pursue a land claim, Indigenous communities here in Canada, they have to borrow money from the government to file under Canadian law in Canadian court, and then prove that they had a pre-existing relationship with the land in question. And there's no onus on the government to provide treaties or leases or contracts or bills of sales or any other documentation to show how Indigenous territories magically became crown lands or provincial parks or whatever. It's the same situation in the States, although I'm less familiar with the legal and the structural details of all of that, because I've been living in Canada most of my life, like over 40 years now. So, I'm just not up on the US situation, but I do know that, every Native American community has a story of how their lands were stolen from them and or they were marched off of them to enable settlers to access the land, to enable corporations to access the land. The genocidal policies that have taken place over these hundreds of years ensured that Indigenous peoples were removed from their ancestral lands and came under the control of either the US or the Canadian governments. In Canada, treaty negotiations were usurped and violated with the passing of the Indian Act, which is legislation that sets the basis for the reserve system, where people were confined onto specific tracts of land, weren't permitted to carry out their usual survival activities, couldn't hunt or fish or trap, couldn't travel without special permissions to visit family or do anything, really. They were made dependent on the federal government legally to receive food, education, healthcare, and so on. This was controlled initially through, all through violence, RCMP, and economic violence through budgets that are controlled in Ottawa, the capital of Canada, military incursions that, have been as recent as, in the last year, when you're looking at the situation of some communities who are in land and fishing disputes here in Canada. First Nations people couldn't even really control their reserve lands because corrupt Indian agents appointed by Ottawa were allowed to sell lands, lease lands, and personally profit from the sale of these lands. If not legally, then no legal action was taken against them for doing these kinds of things. There are universities, since this is a scholarly audience, I just would point out that, there's a lot of universities here that sit on land that was illegally sold to them, that was a part of reserve lands. And certainly almost all of us sit on lands that are treaty lands, or were allocated to First Nations in treaties, because we're all treaty people, actually. We assume that the treaties apply to First Nations and Indigenous folks when they actually apply to all of us. So in 1830s, again, talking about some of the genocidal practices that emerged, the churches started in Canada to establish residential schools. And in 1871, the federal government started to contract with the churches to establish and run more schools on the government's behalf. Residential schools were about converting and civilizing Indigenous peoples under the rally cry of "Kill the Indian, save the child." That was the intention of the official government policy. Those schools were centers of spiritual, physical, mental, emotional, sexual abuse for children aged 4 to 16. They have their counterparts in the US boarding schools. In Canada, we've recently seen over 1,300 unmarked graves on residential school sites where children, died of neglect, abuse, murder. They were never returned to their families, often taken by force, never returned to their families. Well, actually taken by force or coercion of some kind, legal coercions. And for over 100 years, in some cases, families never knew of the fates of their children until now. There are more grave sites being discovered. There's more to come, unfortunately. And there is, I know, a movement in the States demanding that LIDAR, which is ground penetrating radar, be used to locate similar unmarked graves at US boarding school sites. We know that they exist because of the stories of the survivors of those schools. And of course, as you can imagine, the residential school system devastated families, multiple generations suffering from, assuming they survived, suffering from all kinds of forms of PTSD. Residential schools then are, one of many genocidal practices that have impacted Indigenous communities to this day. And I'm never going to have time to do justice here to the fullness of this question, but suffice it to say that the genocide continues to this day, and you see it when you look at policies and practices on both sides of the border around missing and murdered women, Indigenous women, the over-policing of Indigenous communities, or what I would prefer to say, the police terrorism that has been unleashed on Indigenous communities, children's aid policies, or the Department of Child and Family Services policies to remove children from Indigenous families and place them in, less the practice now, but still going on, place them in white families, which also was pretty horrendous practice, at many levels, where children were placed in families that use them as labor, that use them as, will sexually abuse them, and all the other kinds of things that basically happen in residential schools. Not that there weren't families that treated people well, but, still you're taking a child out of their community, out of their family, and placing them in a cultural context where they didn't have access to, their own culture. So still going on. We also see resource extraction industries that are allowed to violate treaty agreements, environmental laws, and they're getting away with it all, when it comes to Indigenous communities on, again, both sides of the border. There was some time ago, I'm really bad with, I'm not good with linear time. I'm going to say that time is a colonial construct as my excuse. But I do remember looking at a map of the proposed, when it was proposed, the Dakota Access Pipeline in BC, and noticed how it went out of its way significantly to avoid white towns and white cities, but almost exclusively hit reserve territories all the way down to the border. And of course, Standing Rock showed us the same pattern in the US, where pipelines avoid major cities and majority white towns, and devastate Indigenous communities. So again, I can't do this question the justice that it deserves, but these days there's so many, and there needs to be more, but I'm just thinking there's like so many more resources than there used to be when I was younger, online resources, books, courses, and the capacity, as much as we want to critique social media, we have the capacity now to actually connect with each other and speak to each other. Urban people can speak to people on reserve territories and all of this. So, I really urge you to learn about these issues for yourself, particularly as they relate to where you live, because wherever you live, if you're in North America, somebody was there before, and it might be nice to know who they were and what happened to them. And we'll talk more a little bit of, we'll talk about that later, but I hope I've answered the question sufficiently for now and not taken up too much of my share of the time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zainab. I think you provided us with so many good examples for us to do more homework on. So we really appreciate that. And I definitely want to see if Shaista, if you have anything else to add to this, would love to hear.
I just want to say thank you so much, Zainab. I don't know what else I can add to this. There's nothing to add. I mean, Zainab has done, from doctrine of discovery to the present moment. I just want to say that, one of the things that I do want to bring our focus on also is that conquest, the violence of colonialism, is always sexual violence as well, right? And so I just, I mean, my work is all about violence. I write about caste violence. I write about Islamophobia. I write about anti-Blackness, everything, right? Anti-indigeneity. But I do want to say this is probably 2013 with, amazing Indigenous lawyer, scholar, writer, organizer, Audrey Huntley. I and a white ally, friend of ours, we were working, maybe this is 2013, I make up my dates too, like I'm not sure, but it's around that time when Harper was still the prime minister. Stephen Harper was still the prime minister of Canada, and we were gathering data around, from Ontario on, gathering stories and data, and numbers as well about missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I just want to say that, I was a complete settler flake, who, despite writing about violence all the time, I could not take it. Like, the stories were so brutal. The stories of violence that were ongoing were so brutal that I just had to, really, really had a breakdown. And, I couldn't deal with that, right? So it's just the ordinariness of this violence. It is the banality of violence, the everydayness of this colonial violence, right? So there are, big movements like land reclamations, which happen, particular in the context of Canada. I'm sure we all know about Oka crisis, which happened in 1990 for, golf course, where the whole military, and that's one of the things that is really important, whether it's in the US or Canada. I'm right now, I'm situated only 40 kilometers from the most notorious, violent border of Tijuana with US, right? So this is my proximity to that violence. But, every time there is anything like this, the military, not just the police, the military comes on the site, right? And this is how, what for the settler nations. I also want to say, just in terms of thinking about complicity, in terms of thinking about how we are all invited to participate in this violence. Like, I work at University of California, San Diego, where in the 1970s, right underneath the chancellor's house, I should say chancellor's mansion, I have been to it. The sort of patio opens onto the Pacific. It's breathtakingly beautiful. Underneath that house, remains of Kumeyaay peoples were found, and the university refused to rematriate, the elders, the ancestors of Kumeyaay peoples back to them because they wanted to study. A colleague of mine, Kanaka Maoli, which means he is indigenous to Hawaii, was I'm not going to go into details because I don't know how much of this is public knowledge, but he was at his lab. He's a social scientist. He was in his lab just very recently, and he found this box and he opened it up thinking it was some equipment because he just started his job at the university. He thought it was some equipment, whatever. He opens it and there are bones, right? There are human remains. I mean, this is the banality. I mean, imagine if we Smileys have these elaborate sacred rituals around burying our dead, right? Like, we all pray, we get together. I mean, imagine these are, I'm not trying to bring us into competition, but I'm just saying, imagine if these were our elders, right? If these were, my father passed away 4 or 5 years ago. I cannot imagine his body being disrespected like that. So, this is the ordinariness of violence, colonial violence. And yeah.
Thank you both so much for sharing these really difficult but important examples, and how, and Shaista, like you talked about how normalized so much of this is that, it sometimes doesn't even bear that shock as much when we do hear these things in the news, but we should be shocked every single time when stories like this do happen. But thank you both, and I hope that this gives us an opportunity to continue learning about, the areas we come from and what those histories look like. Next, I kind of thought we could turn to, a little focus on, I know, some of Zainab's work specifically. We really kind of want to also talk about, how our Indigenous communities and Black communities set up to be against each other. What are the lessons that we could learn from the relationships within Black and Indigenous communities? And, we can kind of also talk about how this applies across multiple communities like ours.
Okay, thank you. And I just want to acknowledge Shaista, you're so humble when you present these things, but I know you've been doing a lot of work on these issues for a long time, and I also so much very appreciate, um, that you're working on these issues, and the work that the scholarly work that you've done, and the words that you're speaking here very much. So yeah, talking about Black and Indigenous relationships. There's a couple of examples. The question is about being set up to be in conflict with each other. And when we focus on that, we forget that there's so many examples as well when these communities came together and cooperated and resisted together. And that's the balance, and there's another side to the story. But just to answer the question, just with some examples, we have several instances where Black folks, again, both sides of the border, would be promised freedom. And Canada did have Black slavery. They enslaved Black peoples as well. So Black folks would be promised freedom if they fought to clear Indigenous people from the lands that settlers wanted. And after emancipation, Black folks were promised land, Indigenous lands, if they fought to clear those lands from Indigenous people on behalf of white settlers. And some Black folks went for that. The most amusing example to me of this comes from the Seminole Wars, which are pre-Civil War. Again, I'm not real good with my dates. If I had my resources here, which I didn't bring with me, unfortunately, but I'm gonna imagine it's around the 1830s. But so when this all began, but the Seminoles, who lived in Florida, were raiding plantations in neighboring Georgia, Alabama, and the southern states, and they were liberating Black folks who had been enslaved on these plantations, and they were killing, of course, the plantation owners or people who managed the plantations. Anyway, so they were bringing African descended folks with them to Florida, where these folks would be adopted into communities and into clans, and they would intermarry and all this sort of thing. That is the Seminoles. So the U.S. military wanted to put a stop to these raids, and so they promised enslaved Black folks that they could earn their freedom by fighting the Seminoles. And so they recruited, several hundred Black folks from these plantations, armed them, marched them into Florida, and every night, if they had 40 fighters, when they woke up in the morning, they'd have 20, and they'd march farther in, and then they'd be left with 10 the next morning, that kind of thing. And so they couldn't even encounter the so-called enemy, because all of these Black fighters that they had recruited would defect or join the Seminoles. And so the Americans didn't learn their lesson, because they tried doing this 3 times, at least that I know of, 3 incursions into Florida with Black folks who had been promised their freedom. And they got their freedom, but it wasn't because it was given to them. Anyways, that didn't work out. And there's a long story that I can't get into around that whole Seminole, what happened with the Seminoles. But these folks that defected to the Seminoles, of course, also took their weapons with them. And so not only was it they were losing people, they were also strengthening the Seminole resistance. The Buffalo Soldiers are another unfortunate example. After emancipation, Black folks were promised land out west of the Mississippi if they would help the U.S. military clear Indigenous people off of those lands. And that's also true of the Texas Rangers, who recruited Black men to clear Indigenous folks and mestizos off of the land, so it would be available for white settlers primarily. Some of the soldiers who fought in these wars did not receive the land that they had been promised. That's happened in many cases. In some cases, the soldiers did receive plots of lands, but those lands were eventually swindled or legislated away or taxed away. So they became landless again. And there are many stories, none of them kind of ending in a landed class of African Americans. So, it's worth noting as well that there were some indigenous folks who were also promised sometimes that they could keep their lands, or they were promised other things if they fought for the US military to clear other tribes off of the land. So that's where you see, these legends of Indian scouts and Indian translators, the Kiowas of the Shoshone who served the US military against the Apaches, Comanches, and so on. So these are all stories that I think, some of them are out there, some of them are exaggerated and embellished, and others have yet to be discovered. I think it's useful to talk to families, because these things aren't necessarily in history books and aren't in official records. But when you actually go and you talk to people who have kept their family stories, you'll discover, like a whole set of historical events that are just like you'd have no idea about. In Canada, the Black Loyalists in Nova Scotia were promised Mi'kmaq land for fighting with the British against the US in the War of 1812. They fought, they didn't get the land, but the Mi'kmaq land was still taken by white settlers. The 5 civilized tribes of the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee Creek, and Seminole. Some of the families in these tribes thought that they could find status and wealth, in owning Black slaves. They wanted to emulate white settler society. And doing that, it was very difficult for their communities on so many levels. Like, we think that these nations kind of like got involved in these things. There were documents signed. There's a lot of polarization, economic polarization, class divisions started emerging in these tribes where none had been before. It was quite divisive for these communities, many of whom, left their tribe and went down to fight with the Seminoles because they didn't like what was happening and the way particularly men had usurped the authorities of women in governance to do some of the things and make some of the agreements that they made. And anyway, so despite the fact that some members of those communities participated in the slave economy, it never saved them from the Trail of Tears, which was a forced march that relocated the tribes east of the Mississippi River out to Oklahoma territory. And those marches were torturous experiences, resulted in a lot of deaths. They were marched out by the army, and it's provided horrific traumas that have been intergenerational. You'll still hear people in their families holding on to these stories. And those Black folks that were enslaved by those nations also made that trip of the Trail of Tears. They marched out with the families that owned them and became members of the communities in Oklahoma. They were part of resettlement in Oklahoma. Yeah, and there's more I can say on that, but there's a lot of resources out there. I'm just giving examples of how these communities have been set up to be enemies or to have conflict. So anyways, that rich, fertile land around the Mississippi was freed up for white settlers through these Trail of Tears marches. In Canada, you have Indigenous folks and whole communities involved in the Underground Railroad, but you also have Indigenous folks involved in the slave trade or in the hunting down of runaways. And again, none of those people escaped the Indian Act, the reservation system, the residential schools. So these are some of the examples from history. Nowadays, through pop culture, I think we're fed the same narratives that white folks consume, about who we are and what our histories have been. We don't really know each other except through films, or pop culture, books that depict our communities as stereotypes for the most part. Hopefully that's changing. It's changed a lot from when I was younger. So I'm happy to share that, because sometimes when you're young, you don't recognize how much things have changed, but that's changed a lot. And it needs to change more, but it's changed a lot. So, when our communities find ourselves kind of thrown together in places like prison, because, we're both overrepresented, Black folks and Indigenous folks, both sides of the border, overrepresented in the prison system. But because these fabricated narratives crafted by white supremacist mindsets, we don't know each other. So, we sometimes have a hard time getting along. Anti-Black racism is real. Anti-indigeneity is real. In spite of all that, as I said, there's some really important examples of when our communities have come together that I wish we had time to discuss, but we don't. But I do want to talk about the lessons, if I can just continue, the lessons of some of the stuff, these events that have occurred in history. And of course, the obvious one is that no one wins. When you play that game of complicity, the idea that you can best serve your family or your community by collaborating in the oppression of others, just leaves you with nothing but smoke. It hasn't worked. Witness, the colonization and the racism that we're still living with, the white supremacy we're still living with, the lateral and violence that we inflict on each other, still ongoing. Complicity doesn't dismantle systemic oppression, doesn't dismantle white settler colonialism or racism. Trading off gains for your community against others, or trading off your personal gains, it just strengthens the system, and it doesn't really allow those who are, sitting pretty at the top of the triangle to experience any consequences for the violence that they perpetrate or benefit from. And it certainly doesn't reshape that triangle into a circle, which is something that I think most of us would prefer to see. There are several scholars that have shown that white settlers were hyper aware of places like Palmares in Brazil, the Black Seminoles of Florida, and the Garifuna and other maroon colonies in the Caribbean and Mesoamerica, where Indigenous and Black people lived and fought together, resisting enslavement, resisting land theft. Across the Americas, there were laws that were passed forbidding friendships, marriages, trade, business relationships across our communities. Fostering division was and is a key pillar of the colonial project. They were terrified of our unity and remain so. That is the politically correct answer to the question, but I'd like, again, to just take some time to offer a spiritual answer as well, particularly to this audience. Political movements have a tendency to underestimate the impact of internal spiritual work over external work. And spiritual practices tend to emphasize the internal over the external work. And the idea that external decolonization and internal decolonization are detached from each other is rooted in the illusion of separation, which is a characteristic of settler colonialism and capitalism. The reality is anyone's internal work impacts everyone to some degree. When highly traumatized communities come together, they're going to trigger each other, despite good intentions. We're going to reflect our unhealed wounds to each other. To a greater or lesser degree, that's the story of every relationship, and what makes the more intimate ones so risky for our hearts, right? Unfortunately, if you're lacking the self-awareness to understand that that's what's happening, right? That we're triggering each other, that you may find yourself looking to change an undesirable reflection by attempting to change the mirror rather than the one looking into it. So I've done a lot of work with Black and Indigenous communities in projects that aim to build relationships across our communities. But this is what happens when Black and Indigenous folks are brought together, inevitably. Not that there aren't some beautiful examples and successes to this work, but the violence of white supremacy has trained us to compete, protect, and defend in all situations, while it has obliterated or severely damaged the cultural knowledges and the resources that our peoples once had to tend to our wellness. We project our traumas onto each other. With healing, however, comes a more expanded awareness of relationships dynamics and a higher sense of self-acceptance and self-trust. So I don't know if this meme that I see on social media all the time that's attributed to Rumi is a correct translation, but the sentiment is correct. You know, your wounds show you what needs healing. There's this level of consciousness where every challenge you encounter, every discomfort you experience, every conflict you have, no matter how it shows up or who might be involved, is an opportunity for self-exploration and healing. And there's a lot of healing to be done, generations of it, many, many generations of it for our peoples. There's a level of awareness where you can see the unhealed parts of yourself in the behavior of others. And in this awareness, you understand how you share a common pain, and your judgment of their actions and yours can melt away into this desire to just express compassion and love. And I feel like, to the extent that I understand Indigenous spiritualities, to the extent that they've been shared with me, and I've been very privileged, to the extent that I have learned about Indigenous African wisdom as well, these are foundational pillars. These ideas are foundational pillars in those practices. So in my experience, there's a lot of opportunity for healing when Indigenous and Black folks come together. And as we heal, we start forming more sustainable, durable relationships. And, and then we become a threat to white supremacy. And that is something that I really look forward to. I've just done a 4-part series for Muskrat Magazine on this question, and I'm going to share it in the chat if anybody's interested. I appreciate this question. I haven't had the opportunity to speak about other types of relationships across our communities, but I certainly feel like there's a lot of lessons for us all to learn as we try and build our relationships and our solidarities and our friendships across our communities. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Zainab. That was really, really extremely insightful. And I think there's so much you shared that I think we can all learn from, as individuals or people living in these communities. And I really love how you spoke about building bridges and how that's like a really powerful, act of resistance, because division is the tool that's used to often keep us from each other. So I really look forward to conversations like these that do help us kind of strengthen those relationships. And I think kind of to your point about lessons, that different communities can learn, I think it could be really helpful for us also to kind of think about and talk about what are the responsibilities, of Muslims as a whole to the indigenous inhabitants of the Americas, and kind of like how have these perspectives and, settler thinking shape how we live as Muslims today, and maybe what are the lessons that we can kind of think about and, work on moving forward. Shaista, would you kind of like to speak to that a little bit?
Sorry, I live near a military base, so you'll hear helicopters all the time. I just want to say I I think I had things to say, but I'm so overwhelmed with what you shared, Zainab. And the fourth part, Muscat series articles, everybody must read those. I mean, read those 4 parts. And there is, you've done this work for such a long time, Zainab, and I just have so much respect and gratitude for this. And also, thinking about how, I mean, even our language is so colonial, right? So when we say Black and Indigenous, as if Black people cannot be Indigenous, I mean, thinking about indigenities in Africa, that's always completely erased. Even in my teaching, I teach and do supervise quite a few graduate students. And it took me a while to realize that I was teaching them to think of Blackness as such a homogenous thing, right? There's so much heterogeneity there in terms of indigeneity, in terms of Blackness. And so I'm just so grateful. And also, just want to say that my vocabulary is also so colonial that, I keep saying Black and Indigenous. It's because this is how we've been taught, right? This is the language in academia, and these connections, these sorts of relationalities are so obscured. So yeah, so thank you so much. One of the things that I, in terms of Muslimness, one of the things that I want to say, I think that is really important, even in terms of our faith, the way in which we live our lives as Ismailis, taking the example of the Imam, I think is really important, right? I think one of the things that has been difficult, it's like you go through graduate school, you get a job, you become a published author and whatever, like all of these things can make you feel like you know things, right? And so so one of the lessons that I have to constantly remind myself, and I'm realizing now more so than ever about just how little I know. And so I think, and especially with the example of the Imam, I think humility is really important. And I want to say that, I'm not here talking about this topic as an expert. I talk about this topic as somebody who constantly fails, right? Like who has, and anybody who's on my Facebook knows that I have been called out by Indigenous peoples. I have been over the years called out by Black folks in terms of how I frame some conversations, right? And so, and I've appreciated that, right? And I think humility is so important. I'm not saying this to promote my work, please nobody read my work, but I recently wrote an article on how for 10 years, right, at University of Toronto and University of California, San Diego here now, I've been teaching about colonial violence for almost 10 years of my life now, and over 10 years actually. And I just thought I was being so cool, right? Like I would bring my students, I taught in sociology and women and gender studies, and now in ethnic studies. I would teach my students to, students who came in without knowing that US is settler colonial or Canada is settler colonial. And I would bring in, all these conversations about ongoing colonialism. And one of the things that I realized very, very recently, as in 2 years ago, the article took a year to get published, right? So very recently, one of the things that I realized is that the ways in which I talk about colonialism was as if that is the whole story, right? And I would go into details about the brutalities of colonial violence, often drawing on work of non-Indigenous scholars. Which was definitely a very colonial thing that I did. And then I would bring in Indigenous scholars to talk about resistance. But what would happen is that the discussion on colonial violence would have made such an impact on the students that when I brought in conversations about resistance, it seemed futile, right? Indigenous people's resistance became futile. And that was so what I basically was teaching students through using the work of racialized scholars and white and Indigenous scholars is that there is no end to colonialism. And today I do want to say that Canada as it exists as a settler state can be ended. And maybe it can be ended in our lifetime. Or the US as a settler state can be ended, and it can be ended in our lifetime, right? So I think for me, as a Muslim, that's really important. I also want to talk about relationalities, and this is the scholarly work that I do as well. One of the things that I realized, through working on my dissertation, is that there were so many encounters between Indigenous peoples and Muslims, even if they were indirect, right? So, for example, to give a very, very quick example, and there's so much to say about this. when Spaniards, when conquistadors, when they encountered indigenous peoples in the New World, they were bringing their experience. Their other for 800 years had been Muslims in Spain, right? I don't know how many people know that when Isabel and Ferdinand, who what is the word I'm looking for, who funded Christopher Columbus's travels to India, right, to the New World, to the Americas, they got that money from conquest of the Iberian Peninsula, which ended the 800-year rule of Muslims, right, 8 centuries. And so when Spaniards, in this way as well, they are so connected. People who were anti-Muslim or the same people who came as white settlers to the Americas, right? The other example, when Spaniards came into contact with indigenous peoples of the New World, they used their understanding of their encounters with Muslims to judge indigenous peoples, right? And so, I mean, there is in Peru too. There's such a rich history. There's such a rich history of how, the Crusaders, right, and the conquistadors were the same people. I mean, there's deep, rich history there that needs to be explored. So, in that sense too, I think our oppressions are so interconnected. So I think it is responsible, it is our responsibility. And one of the other things that I want to say is that, this question of how to decolonize Islamic knowledge is often on the horizon for me as somebody who teaches courses in both, indigenous theory, but also anything to do with Muslims. I'm unfortunately the only Muslim studies scholar on my campus, which is again about Islamophobia, because they think hiring one Muslim is it. So I teach a lot of courses around Muslimness as well. And one of the questions that's always important for me is how to decolonize Islamic knowledges. And what I mean by that is that, the example of tafsir. So I'm not a liberation theologist, right? I do not work with scripture, though I am very, very slowly heading in that direction. Definitely not before my first book. So I draw on the work of Edward Said. I draw on the work of Cherokee scholar Robert Warrior here. I draw on the work of this beautiful, fabulous scholar Shadab Remtullah, who talks about how, this in the Old Testament, there is the notion of Exodus, right? When Israelites left Egypt and were looking for new land. In Exodus, in the Old Testament, Exodus is about dispossession and genocide. So there was this idea that followers of Abraham or Hazrat Ibrahim were promised this new land, where the promised land was what the Canaan, or in Arabic as we say the Canaan, right? Like, so the lands of the Palestinians. And there was this, notion that in the Old Testament that, you go and you destroy the indigenous peoples of Canaan, of Canaan in English, and do this and destroy them so that there's not a single living inhabitant, single indigenous person left, right? In the Quran, if we move to the Quran, the Quran is an anti-colonial text in that sense that, there is complete silence on this notion of the promised land. There is this conception of holy land, of the Holy Land, which is again, Canaan. But this comes in, I'm going to give you the surah. So this comes in chapter 5, which is Surah Al-Maida, which was revealed in Medina. And it's a long surah, but verses 21 to 26. Oh my God, I hope I'm not struck down with lightning for remembering the Quran wrong. It's in the Quran, it's in the words of our prophet. Think about how they went to Medina, the ways in which, they were welcomed, the ways in which they welcomed people in Medina. It's not that they went with any conquest, how the prophet would forgive people of the land that they, fought with for not, people who attacked them, and they fought and then forgave all of them, right? And so even in the example of Makkah. So I think these are all anti-colonial teachings. It is our responsibility as Muslims to do this work. It is our responsibility. It is our place as Ismaili Muslims to be very humble about the limits of our knowledge and to say, I really do not know this, or I grew up being very anti-Black, and so this comes so naturally to me. So even now, as Professor blah blah blah, I can be anti-Black, I can be anti-Indigenous. So I don't know how much of that answers the question, but this is what I wanted to say, that you don't have to look far to learn how to be anti-colonial as Muslims. It is in the Quran itself.
Thank you so much, Shaista, for sharing that. And I think your point about, being humble and it's okay to mess up. I think a lot of the time we're afraid to maybe talk about these issues because we're afraid of using the wrong terms or, but I think so much of what you shared is really just growing and learning as you go along, which is really important. And this has been such a wonderful conversation. And, we do have so many people in the chat who are asking for more ways to contribute to be better allies. So definitely want to take a few more minutes to at least talk about you know, exploring this responsibility, especially as an immigrant community in our country. And, what are some maybe specific or concrete ways that we can continue to be an ally to to this conversation, to Indigenous peoples, and, support these communities. One person also asked, especially as the USA has an upcoming holiday that celebrates the genocide of Indigenous nations, like, this is probably a really opportune time for people to kind of have these conversations in particular. So any thoughts you want to share on, being better allies or tangible ways to support this work? Zainab, if you would like to start.
Sure. Sorry about that. My freaking phone just went off and I thought I had turned it off, so I apologize for that. Oh gosh, okay. Again, when I was younger, all this technology, like we didn't have these issues, man. I'm sorry. I'm still living. I'm a dinosaur. What can I say? Anyways. Yeah, I mean, it's very, I like for folks to figure out, what their responsibilities might be, because they can be so contextualized. But just in general, some thoughts that I have around ideas of responsibility. That's a word that has transformed a lot for me over the years, because I used to think like the idea of responsibility was kind of, it felt like an obligation. It felt like a burden. The way that, colonial society views that word. But then when I was, learning from my teachers in the community in Toronto, from Indigenous communities, this idea of responsibility became something different to me. It became this idea that responsibility is kind of what makes life worth living. It's kind of what makes life good and sweet and joyful. And it's just a matter of reciprocal relationships is what responsibility is to me. So it's the idea that, if you treat the land well, if you're responsible in the way you relate to the land, then you're going to have clean air, clean water, clean food, right? And if you are responsible in your relationships, you're going to have, good partnerships and good family relationships and meaningful friendships and all of this, right? So for me, I just feel like I like to keep it there. I like to keep it at that level. It's not really pleasant to repress or deny or ignore the idea that your standard of living, your rights, your privilege to live on this land is being paid for now, never mind in the past, but is being paid for by First Peoples. That you live well because they don't, because their lands, their children, their mothers, their sisters, their daughters were taken, were abused, were violated, were murdered. But you don't evolve spiritually by keeping yourself ignorant, right? You don't expand your consciousness when you refuse to look at relationship dynamics as that's how we would frame it, or at least the people that I've learned from would frame it. That's how I frame it. If you can see the truth of our interconnection and our interrelatedness, which in this day is just so in your face. There's no denying it. You don't even have to be a spiritual person to like recognize, with the environment and all of this, our global communities, our global connectedness. But if you can acknowledge that everything and everyone is an expression of what I would call spirit or an aspect of spirit, maybe you would use the term Allah or God. If you can acknowledge that everything and everyone is an expression of Allah, then you can understand that being responsible in life expands your life experience and expands your joy. And so that for me all is what is encompassed by that term responsibility. And I really like starting with where you are. I'd said it before. I'll just wind up really quickly now. But whose lands are you on? Where's the nearest Indigenous community? Where did the people, where your house sits, where your workplace sits? Where are those people that used to be there? What happened to them? Learn those stories. Build relationships with people. We have like we can start online. We can develop friendships and relationships. There's community centers in all the cities, friendship centers where you can find Indigenous peoples, and where there may be activities and educational opportunities for you, opportunities perhaps to even volunteer and learn in the process and all of that. And so, yeah, that's what I have to say about that notion. And I'm hoping that folks can find, ways within their own context to respond to this idea of their responsibility towards Indigenous folks. I like to think that if I were living in Palestine, or if I were living in Aotearoa, what would be my responsibilities to an Aotearoa, the Maori, or in Palestine, the Palestinians? What would be my responsibility to those folks? So that's my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, Zainab, for sharing those really important and kind of tangible actions we can take. Shaista, if you have any final thoughts on this as well.
No, I really appreciate what Zainab said. My response, I don't mean it out of hostility, though it might seem so compared to Zainab's response, but I just want to say, sometimes, when people learn about complicity, when people learn about that, that this land is, our lands are colonized lands, and we are participating in as immigrants, settlers, however you frame it, as people who have certain responsibility to Indigenous peoples, they go and try to make friends with Indigenous peoples, for example, or Black people, right? Like having one Black friend, one Indigenous friend is not, it's not the way to get over your responsibility. And I think, while standing in solidarity with Indigenous peoples is really important, think about, turn inward as well. How have you been taught to think about Indigenous peoples, on ITRA, Smiley USA, not Smiley India, sorry, website. I was listening to a story once, and it was, something about faith. I don't remember. This is now 2 years ago, and the pandemic has completely, I shouldn't use that, has messed up my memory. And so one of the things that was being said is that this prince was going to go look for something, and he had an encounter with Adivasis, which are Indigenous peoples of India, and they were going to eat him up, right? I mean, just these notions that Indigenous peoples are, are cannibalistic, or are going to, are people who are not even, human beings like us. I think beginning with the stories that we already know, and starting with that, right? Like, how does indigeneity appear? Where are the Indigenous peoples? What are the stories that we've been fed? And I think also, talking to our children about this, right? Like, what are we learning in schools? How is indigeneity being taught? I mean, if you sit down and look at the curriculum of your children, whether they are in elementary, middle school, high school, wherever, you will find such terrible ways in which indigeneity is being taught about, right? So those of us who grew up in Canada thinking that Iroquois were the violent people who the French fought with, and then realized, oh my God, Iroquois were the Haudenosaunee people who live 90 minutes outside of Toronto, with whom You have beautiful relationships and friendships, and these are people who are completely always overtaken by white mobs who come to do particular kinds of violences. You realize just how anti-indigeneity has been fed to you. And that, I think, is also the responsibility of turning inward and doing with, as Zainab said, starting where we are. Yeah, I think for me that is really, really important.
Thank you both so much for those really reflective thoughts and this discussion. I mean, I'm sure that we could go on for hours. Like, I think a lot of the audience is, they're so excited to hear about this conversation that I think we've all been really wanting to do for a long time. And I love that you all gave, so many actions we can take, whether it's our internal work within, our families and the communities in which we live. I think just even starting from kind of reflecting on that, kind of understanding the narratives that we've been taught. Those are some really, small but actually really big, ways that we can begin to kind of transform these ideas. And so, I want to thank you both so much for all of your time, your education, all of this labor that you just did for us. We really, really are grateful for that. And thank you to the audience for joining us today, for sharing their questions, that helped to frame this really beautiful conversation, hopefully, which will be one of many. And this is just the start of this critical conversation. So today was really, really, I'm grateful to be in this space with you both. And I feel like I took away so much, and I can't wait to kind of reflect on that some more. And I hope that was the same for the audience here. So thank you again. And, before we sign off, just a few quick announcements. So, in the chat box, obviously we've pasted some resources throughout, but we will share a few more resources that we can all kind of take home and take a look at. And for the recording of this conversation and any past conversations, you can visit Facets of Faith page on the .Ismaili USA. So we'll be putting that in the chat as well. And please continue to look out, for more info on the .Ismaili/USA webpage and social media pages for young adult conversations this week and our next critical conversation. So we will be continuing to have a lot of these discussions. And lastly, please take the survey at the end of the session that will pop out on your screen as you leave. So this will hopefully help us better shape conversations in the future. So thank you, Shaista, and thank you, Zainab, and thank you to the audience, everyone. Take care and Nyal Mudat.